In this video, I'm going to look at a game I played on Tuesday, a week ago, in a Sussex League match for Horsham 1 against Brighton 1. The match was played at Horsham. I was on board 3. I had the black pieces and was up against Mikolaj Rogacewicz. My opponent started with d4 and play developed into a King's Indian defence after knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4, d6. My opponent went for the sameish variation with f3, and after castles played bishop e3. This is the old way of playing the sameish. It was long believed that this move prevented an immediate c5 in response, but then it was discovered that black could play that as a pawn sacrifice anyway. As a result, white started exploring the alternatives. One was bishop g5, although black can still play c5 then, although the argument is that the bishop is better placed on g5 than on e3. Or, and this seems to be the modern preference, knight on g to e2, not committing the bishop on c1 at all, waiting to see what black intends to play and then position the bishop appropriately. As it happens, black can still play c5 here. Anyway, in the game my opponent played bishop e3 and I played c5, which is a pawn sacrifice, although white nowadays pretty much never accepts it, because after d takes c5, d takes c5, queen takes d8, rook takes d8, bishop takes c5, knight c6, although queens have been exchanged, black has ample compensation for the pawn because of the weak dark squares in the white camp and the fact that white is still struggling to complete his development. Anyway, rather than taking on c5, my opponent played the flexible knight on g to e2, maintaining the tension. I continued with the standard knight c6. Now, white could still accept the pawn sacrifice, but this would just lead to the same position. And there's no really sensible way for white to continue to maintain the tension, so he decided to close the centre with d5, which is the main move. Black played knight e5, hitting the pawn on c4, and so white pretty much has to move the knight on e2 so that the bishop on f1 will defend the pawn on c4. Now the usual move is knight g3. Now black played h5, which is a common move when white moves the knight to g3 in these kinds of positions, because the threat of h4 is actually a little inconvenient for him. White played bishop e2, so now after h4, which is what black played, white can retreat the knight to the f1 square, knight f1. Now, black played e6. The idea of this is to aim to transpose to a line of the modern Benoni, which is reasonably promising for black. Now in this position, white has a number of possible moves. The move f4 is his sharpest option, although the complications after this seem to work out well for black. And so the move bishop g5 has consequently become the main line. Now, this move does show a downside to playing bishop e3 early because it loses a tempo, but on the other hand it has a couple of very serious points to it. The first is that white is threatening to take the black pawn on h4, and the second point is demonstrated by the game continuation. Now, in this position, queen b6 getting out of the pin has been black's most common choice the move also hits the pawn on b2. But I had anticipated that my opponent would play this variation all the way up to bishop g5 on move 12, and I had a surprise prepared for him. The move I chose was e takes d5. Now, if white was to play c takes d5, we would have a line of the modern Benoni which is perfectly fine for black. However, we do see what the other point of the move bishop g5 here, which is that white can play knight takes d5. And white's idea is to establish a piece on the d5 outpost, most probably a knight. And if black now continues quietly, white will prove to be better positionally because of his superior pawn structure. So black needs to act quickly. I responded with bishop e6. Now the idea of this is to just take on d5 when white will have to take with the c pawn, and it will lead to a typical modern Benoni pawn structure. And indeed this will be a favourable version of it because black has exchanged his light square bishop for one of white's knights. And in this kind of position, white's knights are a lot more useful than black's bishop on c8, which is often a bit of a problem piece. Anyway, as it happens, white should have probably accepted that black was going to play bishop takes d5 and taken the pawn on h4, bishop takes h4. Although black has two decent continuations here. He could play b5, or he could play bishop takes d5, c takes d5, c4. And in both cases, he has adequate compensation for the pawn, although white's position is perfectly playable as well. However, white now plays an incredibly tempting move, which is in fact a serious mistake. And that move was, instead of bishop takes h4, knight on f to e3. Now, from a positional point of view, this makes perfect sense. It's part of white's strategy to establish a piece on d5. Unfortunately for white, there's a serious tactical flaw. Black now responded with knight takes d5, sacrificing his queen, but getting quite a few pieces in return. Play went bishop takes d8, knight takes e3, and now if white plays queen c1, black plays bishop h6, threatening knight takes g2 check, and this position really isn't any good for white. Because white has to respond to this threat, black will be able to follow up by taking the bishop on d8, probably with his rook on a8, and he would have a big material advantage. The same scenario unfolds after queen d2, bishop h6. It's the same threat. So, understandably, rather than putting his queen on c1 or d2, my opponent played queen b3. But now he runs into a rather more insidious tactical point. Play goes knight takes g2, king f2, knight f4. Now, it seems that white can win back some material with bishop e7, and indeed this is the move he tried in the game, and that he has to try. But now black has a very surprising response, which is knight takes e2. Now, the problem for white is that he can't take the knight on e2, because after king takes e2, bishop takes c4 check wins back the white queen with interest. So instead of king takes e2, white took the rook on f8, and after rook takes f8, he still can't play king takes e2 because of bishop takes c4 check, so he played queen takes b7. And this gives a position with a very unusual material balance. Black has 4 minor pieces for a queen and a rook, and White's pawn structure is in a very poor state. And moreover, as it turns out, his king's a bit exposed too. So this position is just a disaster for White. Black played knight d4, hitting the pawns on c4 and f3, so White will have to lose one of them. White now decided to defend the pawn on c4 with b3. Now, at various points in what follows, White could have taken the a pawn, queen takes a7, perhaps hoping to rush his a pawn down the board, but this would take far too long. And here, for instance, Black could just play f5, and his attack against the white king is going to be a lot quicker and more effective. So instead of queen takes a7, White played b3, but then Black could just take the other pawn with knight on e takes f3. Now, over the next few moves, White was unable to find anything really constructive to do, while Black gradually improved the position of his minor pieces before finally breaking with f5. So, queen e7, hitting the pawn on d6, but Black was able to defend it easily with bishop e5, a move which also brought his dark squared bishop to a very strong square. White played rook on a to d1, perhaps hoping to bring his rook into the game, but it didn't really achieve anything. Black played bishop g4. This is a very sort of useful move, as the bishop is strongly placed on the h5 d1 diagonal, and it also supports the knight on f3. White was provoked into playing h3, but Black just dropped the bishop back with bishop h5. White played another somewhat aimless rook move with rook c1, and Black finally broke with f5. And the white king is now going to be horribly exposed, and there's really not a lot he can do about it. He decided to rush madly forward with king e3, but after f takes e4, he faced the threats of knight f5 check, winning the queen due to the fork, or bishop f4 check, skewering the king on e3 and rook on c1. White continued with his mad rush with king takes e4, but now Black had a very strong move in bishop f6. This forces the white queen off the e-file, which allows rook e8 check, among other threats, such as knight g5. So if White had played queen takes a7, Black would have played knight g5 check with similar consequences as in the game. As it happened, instead of queen takes a7, White played queen takes d6, and then Black responded with a strong knight g5 check, and none of the king moves are any good. So for instance, there's king f4 when I was intending during the game to play bishop e7 check, which is good enough. Although the computer pointed out, and I might have seen this if this happened in the game, bishop e5 check, king takes e5, rook f5 mate. But as I said, bishop e7 check rather than bishop e5 check should have been perfectly good, and my opponent was never going to go into that. So instead of king f4, white could play king e3, but then black can just play knight f5 check, forking the king and queen. And this was obviously going to dissuade my opponent from going down this route. Although the computer suggests that even more incisive is rook e8 check, followed by king d2, knight e4 check, or king f2, knight e4 check. But I think this is just splitting hairs. Knight f5 check would have been perfectly adequate. Now, instead of king e3, or indeed king f4, a third alternative was king d3. Then play would have gone bishop e2 check, and king d2 is met by knight e4 check, forking king and queen. King c3 is met by knight e4 check again, with a fork of king and queen, and king e3 is met with either knight f5 check, which I think was my intention when analysing this during the game, or rook e8 check, king f2, knight e4 check, which is the computer's suggestion, but both are perfectly good. So those were the three alternatives to what was played in the game, that is king d3, king e3, king f4. And instead of those, my opponent played king d5, rushing forward, but this is no good as well. Bishop f3 check, king takes c5, knight e4, forking king and queen. Now, obviously, white is completely lost here as he's losing back his queen. Now, as it happens, he also is liable to get mated in short order as well. And apparently, if white is really desperate to avoid getting checkmated quickly, he could play king b4, although this is obviously hopeless for him after knight takes d6, because black has 4 minor pieces against rook and pawn. However, no human's going to play king b4 if he decides to keep playing in this position, and instead he played king d5. Now, here I responded with the most obvious move, knight takes d6 check, picking up the queen, which is obviously perfectly good. And even if there wasn't a forced mate in short order, which in fact there is, it's a perfectly sort of sensible way to play, because black is obviously winning on material, if nothing else. However, if perhaps I'd thought for a little longer, I would have seen that instead of knight takes d6, black can actually mate in 2 moves, with knight f2 check, with a discovered attack on the king, king c5, the only response, and then knight d3, which is checkmate. But this is a little difficult to visualise because the balance of pieces and the arrangement of pieces, indeed, is very, very unusual. And so it's not surprising that I chose the rather more obvious move instead of knight f2 check, and played knight takes d6 check instead. Now, apparently, white could have tried to prolong things with king c5, although after rook b8, which is quite a funny move, but the point is that if white then decides to play king d6, rook d8 check just leads back to the game continuation, which is a very quick mate. So after rook b8, well, obviously the material balance is massively in black's favour anyway, but black ought to mate white pretty quickly here. So for instance, after rook on c to e1, knight on 4 to f5, followed by bishop d4 mate is unstoppable. After rook on h to e1, rook b6, followed by knight b7 mate is unstoppable. And indeed, after rook b8, black has several threats if white essentially does nothing. And one of these is knight e4 check, king d5, rook d8 mate. And another is rook b6, followed by knight b7 mate or knight e6 mate. Anyway, all of that's a bit academic, because even if black didn't have this forced mate, clearly he should win in the long term because of his massive material advantage. Anyway, instead of the frankly inhuman king c5, my opponent played the more natural king takes d6. But then, after rook d8 check, he suddenly realised that he was going to get mated on the next move. If he played king c5, I would have played bishop e7 mate. As it happened, he decided to play king c7 when I played knight e6 checkmate.